Hello. Um, Coming to you again to discuss Black psychological perspectives here at Oakwood University, discussing education and work, which is chapter 6 from Belgrave's and Allison's book, African American Psychology. Before we get into that, I always start with a word of prayer, and then we go ahead and discuss issues related to Black psychology. Thanks again for joining us, and hopefully this is informative to you. All right. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity for us to be able to share information regarding African American psychology, specifically education and work. All right. So, as I begin, as always, I like to let people know if they really want the notes, I could send those to you if you're interested, and you can look down below. I put the information there to contact me via email, and I can get back to you if you'd like. So I have a picture here, and it's been one of these memes that's gone around about equality, equity, reality, and what people are interested in regards to liberation. The first picture there has I like to think of as maybe three brothers. One is extremely tall, one is a little shorter, and one is too short to see over a fence to watch a ball game. Looks like a baseball game, could be a cricket game, could be a rugby match for as far as I'm concerned. But they are trying to see this game, right? The other meme or the other picture there next to it sees that there's equity, that there's three boxes here. For the shorter brother is given two, the middle brother is given one box, and the really tall brother is given none, but they can all see over the fence to watch the game. What they show in the third kind of part to this meme is the reality. And what someone is proposing as reality is that one person who's already tall or already has an advantage gets at least 10 boxes to stand on, and they see head and shoulders beyond what anyone else can see. The next person gets one box and they're just able to see over the fence. Then the shortest person, who's already unable to see over the fence, is dug deep into a hole. So there's three, and the final one is about liberation, where they get rid of the fence altogether. And it almost seems as if the brothers are a part of the game, right? If anybody's followed any of my YouTube talks and my strange but I think timely observation as I look back over these last couple of years, that it's all right for Black men to stop playing sports for other people and go ahead and, take on life in real time. And that could be our own liberation in and of itself when it comes to economics, when it comes to education, begin that liberatory process. But I started there, and we'll move along further into some of these vocabulary words, right? And I have a few of these here. I don't know exactly how many, but I'll go through them quickly. And I have some that are not in the book, and I'll explain some of those that are not in the book. But definitely vocational careers is the first start, right? And understanding vocational careers. As a school psychologist, when I worked with special ed students, we had vocational specialists and people who would talk about what these vocations are, right? But as I think about my profession, what I profess that I am to be, or I am vocal about my occupation, right? And what occupies my time, these vocational careers, right, are important to be aware of. Another word to look up is demographics, and understand how important demographics are to people making decisions about policy. A next term is the talented 10th. And last week I discussed, or last session, number 5, this is number 6, but last session we talked about the talented 10th. and Du Bois' view on the talented tenth. Next vocabulary word is the Bible or the black belt, right? I could start with the Bible Belt, but I'll talk about the black belt. And the Bible Belt, if I'm in the South, has to do with places in the South where people really strongly believe in the Bible and Christianity. And if you on the block here at Oakwood, Oakwood is down the street from at least 6 different houses of worship on the same block, right? And that is the Bible Belt. Well, if we carry that same concept forward, we have the black belt. And I lived in Huntsville, Alabama for a year when I was a student back in the 90s, before I even knew that there was a so-called white side of town. I was really stuck with the idea that there were all these black folk here, and most of the black people in the United States live in a particular area within the black belt, and particularly after the 1930s through the 1970s, they were all kind of in one place, and that's that black belt, right? Another vocabulary word is disparity, right? One that is not in your book is called stratification, and sociologists often use that term, but it has to do with, how people are placed within status within society, but also how people are dealing with economic opportunities and access within society, and the stratification, right, within our society. Next word is inequality. You'll hear these words. I kind of broke down some of the difference between equity, equality, and some of the realities of life, but there's also definitely inequality that does occur, right? Another word that is not in your book, but I think covers a lot of what is being talked about, is the Maafa, right? And Maafa is an African term. It's a great disaster, right? I think it's a Kiswahili term. In this great disaster that's gone on from, the 1400s all the way through until now, when black people were enslaved, particularly in North America, but also throughout the world, and continuing on now into the prison industrial complex, into our own type of healing as a result of this Maafa. That's a part of the other side of making it to the other side. There was definitely some tipping points. I would say within the 1950s and 60s. Some folks might call that a dawn of a new age. I just simply call it, it's about time. Miseducation and diseducation. The book mentions those as well. Miseducation means to make sure that you're missing the mark and someone is doing that. And diseducation means to actually disinform you or keep you out of the light of what you need to know, right? Sometimes you're trying with miseducation, but you just miss. But diseducation is a deliberate attempt to not inform you and not educate you. The last one is training, right? And there is a difference between education and training. Training is the information you simply need to get the certificate or the diploma that you need. But education is the thing that helps you to find light in the world and rightness and goodness. All right. So those are our vocabulary words, and I'll go through them again. Vocational careers, demographics, talented 10th, black belt, disparity, stratification, inequality, Maafa, miseducation, diseducation, and training. Right. So some demographics that were discussed in the book. African Americans have shown increases in education attainment since the 1940s, right? And largely after World War II, you had all these folks who had been trained, like the Tuskegee Airmen or Patton's Black Tank Brigades, right? And they come back to their towns. Sometimes they're, respected and treated well. Sometimes they're disrespected, but there's also a GI Bill. They have access to be able to go to college. High school rates increase, right? College attendance increase. 1970s as well was another key benchmark. And in class, I'm having people talk about why these two things were important. But if you spend some time looking at World War II in the 1970s for black people, you'll see that government, but also, educated black people stepped in to make sure that growth occurred and access occurred to educational as well as monetary opportunities. Another demographic that was interesting, all test scores improved for black and white students by 2007, but black students' test scores are what white students' test scores were in 1990. And this is a 2007 metric, so we're about 20 years behind, but we are growing nonetheless. So African American school completion rates, I had some data here, and some of that data indicated that if you have, by 2010, African Americans, almost 85% of African Americans are earning high school diplomas. College graduation, or at least going to college, going from high school to college, there is a huge increase. African Americans in the 70s were at about 43%, and by 2010, it was almost 65% of at least African Americans were going from high school to college. As far as finishing college, that's a different story, right? Finishing college, African Americans are still only at about 20%, but that's a huge increase from the 1940s when barely 5% went to college or finished college, and even the 1970s when less than 15% were finishing. Not growing as fast in that finishing of college. I would say a lot of that has to do with the monetary factors, and we're talking about both education and work, and some of the reasons why people need to go to work. Right? Okay. Some of the theories and issues, and I mentioned before, the Mayafa from the 1600s, or really the 1400s, is still ongoing. There has been legal and societal discrimination and anti-blackness as well, right, as a part of that Mayafa. And I'm saying that coldly and plainly, but it's a reality that I've come to understand. I'm not angry anymore because I'm clear about what I need to do about it. I think the anger comes when you're not clear about what you need to do about this ongoing Mayafa that's been going on for, over 500 years. There's a group of researchers and activists who have been working on this project called the Angela Project. And so Angela was the first documented African person who was enslaved in what is now the United States, back in, I believe it was 1419 or 1619, but my dates are off, but I know somebody can check me on that. But this Angela Project is about really addressing these things of economic inequality. Black people, as we talked about in chapter 4 regarding racism, black people were not just locked out of property, but were actually the property. They were seen as property, like a horse, like cattle, like a apartment building, right? And were able to even provide their owners passive income. How do you recover from that? And when it happened for hundreds of years, right? So poverty, in that sense, is designed by a legal and societal process. And it doesn't just end. It's like trying to turn around a huge ship that's been moving very quickly in one direction. And then it's going to take at least a third of the time, or maybe, tenth of the time to turn that around, right? Okay. All right, enough speculation there. Let me get back to some of these other things. Childhood educational experiences. Head Start, special education, gifted and suspension, gifted classes, suspension rates, lack of funding, untreated trauma, unrecognized talent when it comes to black students, right? Amos Wilson, he's a psychologist that folks should know about, although it's not mentioned in the book at this time. He wrote a book called The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, and also Awakening the Natural Genius of the Black Child. And in these two books he wrote in the 70s, his premise was that black children, when they're born, all the indicators are that they are ahead of just about any other child that they're compared with, particularly in America, but definitely white children, right? And that was kind of the conversation coming out of the 60s. How do black people compare to white people? Once legal segregation is over, how do they compare? Well, black children were ahead when it came to indicators of awareness, right? Response to sound, being able to stand up, sit up, developmental milestones, right? But by the time they even got to preschool, they were treated differently and likely ended up behind by the time they got to first grade. What was this about? Why were students not getting access to the things that they need, being shunted into things like special ed, but not into classes for gifted and talented rates, being suspended for behavior? And this is still an issue. There are preschool students who are suspended or even expelled for behavior, right? Some of this has to do with lack of funding. Some of this might have to do with untreated trauma, but definitely unrecognized academic talent, right? So there's a lot that's been said about parents and family and connecting schools, and I'm writing an article presently about that, about parents' experiences with schools and mental health. But definitely all these research articles I'm reading for the research I'm writing about has to do with this cultural mismatch, right? Miseducation and diseducation, but definitely this cultural mismatch of the expectations for the home may be different for the school regarding what the outcomes should be about education. Should it be about a job, or should it be about really changing the community, right? I would say, and I would follow Dr. Amos Wilson's conversation, that the education system we have is designed as it should be, right? And I've even heard some quotes attributed to Nelson Mandela talking about that poverty is a man-made construction, right? And we've designed our systems for poverty. We've designed our systems for certain groups not to do well. And I would even say, sitting here upon this HBCU campus, there are certain outcomes that indicate that our system is designed to get exactly what we've been getting. So how do we work against those systems, even when our own systems work against us? And I'll talk about this next idea here. When it comes to testing and accountability, so let's say you want to be in one of these higher level classes, or these classes that will help you go on to do the types of things you want to do with your life and give you more options, right? For Black students, sometimes they may suffer from stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is enacted. The threat becomes viable when someone tells Black students, and this has been well documented from Claude Steele at Stanford, right, along with his work with Arnson. If you read the book, the Social Animal, Social Psychology book, long-standing conversation about issues with prejudice. It also happens for white students, but let me start talking with Black students, right? Black students, the stereotype threat gets triggered when they're about to take a test and somebody said, this is a measure of your intelligence. For whatever reason with our society, that word becomes toxic to Black students, particularly high achieving Black students. They're looking to go to college, so they're going to take the SAT or the ACT or some other test that's going to help give them a gateway into higher level instruction. And they tend to do worse, even though they know the same subject matter. Watch this. If they tell the Black students that this is a test of Black students' excellence, they do better. It's like this head trip that happens, right? White students, if they tell white students, and I'm talking more recently within the 2000s, they're being told that they're going to be compared to Asian students, white students tend to do worse. If women are told that tests are going to test them against men, particularly around math, women do worse. But you give them the same test and you tell them this is a test of women's intelligence and skill and brilliance, they do better, right? The phenomena is a verifiable and scientific, clinically tried, empirically studied phenomena, stereotype threat. And it's there and it's real, but it impacts people's access to colleges, impacts their access to certain jobs and other work issues, right? This last issue here that we're talking about is training versus education. There are many people who receive training. There are many people who may be African American or Black who have received PhD level training, but they receive very little education. It means they know very little about how to help other Black people from day to day. they're so into whatever educational experience that they had that they forget about others, and they're so focused on making money or other things. So they're trained to do things for other people, in essence. If you're trained to do things for other people, you're not educated and you don't have the light, right? And I've heard Dr. Naeem Akbar talk about education and the root word meaning to bring forth light, right? They're not brought forth into this light of knowledge, if I were to take it back to Egypt or whatever, that allows you to be able to share knowledge with other people. Because, and we can get more into that, but man, I only got so much time. All right, so next slide. HBCUs and higher education. At historically black colleges and universities, African American students demonstrated greater emotional autonomy, which is interesting, right? You've heard of IQ, intelligence quotient, but there's also EQ, and African American students are able to demonstrate these broader ranges. Some other studies have shown, and then when I went to the convention last year in 2018, 2018, that summer, I saw poster sessions, but also paper sessions where people were talking about African American students at HBCUs were more likely to access even mental health services because the environment was supportive, more supportive of them getting that type of help. So this emotional autonomy is important at historically black colleges. If we were to discuss HBCUs versus primarily white or historically white institutions, there's not really a difference in students' racial identity, whether one is more or less black. And if we think about the scales that we were talking about, black identity development, and the Nigressen scales or other types of scales of black identity, no, black students are black students no matter where you find them in colleges and universities here in America. An ethnically diverse environment contributes to positive outcomes for all students. What many people may not realize is that HBCUs are ethnically diverse. Although the people's skin color may be similar, their backgrounds are from around the world. Just on this hallway, I count, and I'm talking about our Center for Student Success, where I'm at here at Oakwood. We have people from, I'm counting the countries, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, specifically the Virgin Islands, Haiti, where else? Another person from the Virgin Islands, another person from Uganda, and then some folks from the United States and different parts of the United States. I'm just talking about the hallway. There's 6 different people who work here. That does not include the amount of students. We have over 50 different ethnicities at a campus that has over 1,600 students, right? So diversity is important, and an ethnically diverse environment is important. I would say that we have about as many ethnicities that I had in my high school in California, which was not a predominantly black school, but we have, I would say, maybe more, twice as many ethnicities represented at this HBCU. So HBCUs are ethnically diverse and growing more so each year, and particularly more Latino students are coming to some HBCUs, and I know for sure at our HBCU that is the case. And I know at other ones, particularly in Texas and other places, and that also comes with more money, but it also comes with a unique opportunity to consider what does an HBCU contribute to the world and contribute to those who are not. Because we offer a very different idea about higher ed. We say to the rest of the world that, look, give us anyone and we'll educate them. Give us, and this is how we started, the people who were oppressed, maligned, and told that they had no soul and told that they could not read, and within a generation we'll turn them around to be college educated. That's what HBCUs do, and that's extremely powerful. How can Latinos, and I'm particularly talking about folks where I come from, how can Chicanos come to an HBCU and replicate that same process or enhance what's going on with La Gente or their people, right? Our public schools, or particularly if we're talking about Oakwood and students coming to our academies, Seventh-day Adventist academies, adequately preparing students for higher education? That's a great question. in my office, at the Center for Student Success, we see students coming in varying states, but that's a question worth contemplating, particularly if we're talking about black students attending predominantly white institutions, historically white institutions, or HBCUs, right? Next, and the last piece, we talked about stereotype threat before, but I really want us to continue to keep that in mind as students are taking tests ongoing. And what triggers stereotype threat, and how do you counteract stereotype threat? One way to inoculate yourself from stereotype threat that we didn't talk about earlier, but one way to inoculate yourself from that is to be clear on who you are and your academic identity, and have your ethnicity related to a strong academic identity. I know I come from a long line of people who are brilliant and excellent. And so whatever you say to me about how I do or do not do on this test, or whatever group I'm being compared to, I really don't care. I know I'm excellent. So, but that comes from having a clear understanding of what my identity is. For many Americans, and particularly African Americans, not knowing where you come from is a challenge due to migration, due to forced migration, due to forced separation. Right? That's a pattern going back 500 years, but it still occurs for many different reasons. If you want a breakdown of even, or an example, I should say, of that type of thing, see the autobiography of Malcolm X and what happened to his family. It happened to my family as well, particularly happened to my father. So understand what that means and what that can do to someone's sense of who they are. And also the amazing strength, like W.B. Du Bois talked about, that black folks are held together by their sheer dogged strength, being both African and American in one dark body, reconciling their own strivings. Man, don't get me quoting Du Bois, man. I'll get all hyped up. All right. So some final pieces here as we get towards the end. Evidence-based practice. Many myths have existed about black people in America and where Americans have been in relation to education and work. Correcting those myths with facts, it takes time. And I would also say, for those of you who are following along, or for those of my students, be clear that not everybody's going to understand what you're talking about when it comes to this black psychology, this science, right? Scientists, particularly those scientists who break myths, in some points in time, they were thought to needed to be, excommunicated, or worse yet, killed for having outside of the box ideas, because they were using science, which was thought to be magic. There's a lot of magical thinking that still goes on around black people. And no diss on black girl magic. I got 2 daughters and they are total black girl magic. But I can tell you the science behind their magic too. Comes from some very strong intention, and from very clear parents who, and grandparents and family, and the social network that helped with that. Right? It didn't just happen. Right? Improving schooling and work has required steps such as raising expectations, yet documenting efforts to improve the lives of black people. I would say raise your expectations for what black people can do, but also take time to write down the amazing things you see black people doing from day to day. Right? Yuri Treisman was a professor at UC Berkeley, and he had study groups for math. He found that, and he had the advantage of knowing that if you made it to UC Berkeley, you had to be exceptional. So he just assumed all his students were exceptional. But he found that his Asian students were doing better than many of the other students, particularly if he talked about his black students. They were hanging out, but not studying together. So Dr. Treisman made it a requirement for all students to study together. And magically, all of his students rose together. Right? And he broke up the groups and was doing it. He found that his Asian students were also studying together, maybe not hanging out together, but they were definitely studying together. White students, it was a mix. So having them all study together raised all the algebra scores for entering freshmen, or all the math scores, I should say, for entering freshmen at UC Berkeley. We owe a great debt to Yuri Treisman in this study. All right. So some things not highlighted in the book. And man, I found all these resources online about some of the things I'm going to tell you about. But women and girls' educational and health outcomes have risen from the 1970s till now, to the point that by 2050, they're definitely going to surpass men in pretty much every statistic you could think of in life. And that's a crisis for particularly Americans, but definitely for Black Americans or African Americans. There's another conversation that really wasn't in the book, but it's worth considering: the debate about African immigrant success versus African American success or lack thereof. Just one basic thing: if you are an African immigrant or an immigrant from the Caribbean who is of African descent and you end up in America, you likely had some things going on for you that the African American may not have had. Like, there's still people on that island, there's still people back in the continent who didn't make it because they didn't have access to those same things. So an immigrant has a certain level of status, access, and information that a native person to America may or may not have, right? And some folks have even found that some African immigrants owned African slaves or sold them, right? And that's how they made their money. But they have access to land and property, which is an important part of American life, as we've discussed before, which can inoculate you against some of those issues of racism. Okay. I know that it's like a big one to unpack, but I'm just touching on it because the book didn't really get into it. I may have to devote a whole other thing just to talk about that. There's two more here, and then we're done. Carter G. Woodson's book. Oh, man. And I'm so excited about this book. Written in 1919. Most everybody knows about Carter G. Woodson's book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Everybody's heard about it, but I've run into very few people who've actually read it. Here's another book by Carter G. Woodson that very few people have read. It's called The Education of the Negro Prior to 1861. This is an important work. It talks about what Black people knew and how they were being trained, and it makes us think about some of the vestiges that are still continuing to occur when it comes to training and designing Black disinformation and miseducation and diseducation, right? Black children, especially sons, even from families with millions of dollars, are likely to live in poverty. Yes, new study came out last year that says that. The wealth gap that was created by legal discrimination is growing, according to Badger, Pierce, and Keeley. And I put links to those in the notes. So if you want those notes, I could send that to you, but that's one of the latest things out there, and the book's not talking about this, but wow. Generational wealth is not being passed forward for Black folk, and the data's there to show it. That's a huge problem. I'm just unpacking that, but our only two pieces were education and work. I know we're going to have a good discussion about this. So anyways, I hope all is well with you. I'm glad you were able to join us for this discussion. Again, if you have any questions, if you're interested in our notes or our slides or whatever, get at me. bgamble@oakwood.edu. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Peace.